Hello, welcome to the LD4 2022 conference, Linking Global Knowledge. I'm Jim Hahn, I'm the session facilitator. Before I introduce our speakers, I do have a few resources of interest to the attendees to help you navigate the conference. So we have the conference website link, has a lot of great resources. There you can find our code of conduct. I'll drop that also in the chat. There is an anonymous reporting link. You can anonymously report any violations of the code of conduct, and we'll work as quickly as possible to resolve those. For social, we're using the hashtag LD4 2022 if you have linked data conference tweets. Technical assistance also during the conference is available by way of our conference Slack. I've dropped the Slack link into chat as well. So there is a tech support channel there. And also, if you want to choose to continue the conversation for any session here this week, you'll find channels in the conference Slack for that purpose. And for the duration of the week, most of the sessions are either recorded or we're streaming them. So you'll be able to find recordings later on our LD4 YouTube presence. This one is being live streamed. And the link, if you missed it at the top, here's another link again to the LD4 YouTube web presence. So with that being said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will introduce our speakers for today. So we have three speakers. Allison Ballund is a cataloging and acquisition specialist at San Diego State University. She is current chair of the CSU Inclusive Descriptive Task Force and is interested in critical cataloging, comics, and Wikidata. Aaron Canning is the ontology systems analyst and the linked data infrastructure for Network Cultural Computing Project, aka LINKS. They're interested in feminist and queer approaches to data practices, particularly semantic data modeling. Aaron holds master's degrees in information and museum studies from the University of Toronto, where they conducted research examining how information systems can be designed to accommodate affect as a fundamental way of knowing material culture. Bree Watson is a PhD student at the University of British Columbia's iSchool, focusing on histories of information and the practice of equitable cataloging in libraries, archives, museums, and special collections. Watson is the archivist historian of the American Psychological Association's Consensual Non-Monogamy Committee and on the editorial board of Homosaurus, an international linked data vocabulary for queer terminology. For 2022-2023, they are one of UBC Libraries Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Scholars in Residence. Take it away.
I think you might have forgotten Aaron.
No, Jim introduced me second.
Okay.
But I'm going to say that is fine.
Thank you.
The screen that we can see is currently the speaker notes.
Oh no, let me reshare it then. Thank you.
No problem.
How does this look? Is this still the speaker notes?
Yes, it is.
Oh no. All right. I'm going to stop my share. Never seems to work exactly as you like it, does it? All right, let's try this one more time. If not, I will probably have one of you share it. How are we looking at now?
Looks great. I can see the slides.
That's good.
Oh.
No, we're back to the speaker notes.
We're back to speaker notes. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Will one of you mind sharing the slides? And I can do the talking. And then we'll just swatch off.
Yes, give me one moment. Sorry.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming today. This moment while we get everything organized. And I'll just start by saying thank you to Jim. Thank you for everybody for setting this up today. And thank you for being with us. There we go. Thank you so much.
No problem. Can you see just the slides and not the other like Zoom stuff?
Yep, just
Great.
the slides.
Perfect.
Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. Before we beginning, we're speaking to the unceded territories of the Ute, the Kumeyaay, the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, Mississaugas of the Credit, all of whom had traditional and ancestral land occupied and taken, often violently by the so-called settler nations of Canada and the United States on Turtle Island. We are uninvited settlers on this land, and as such are beneficiaries of colonialism and genocide. Canada and the United States continue this genocide today through cultural extermination, mass pollution, and murder. And we invite you to learn and reflect and take action to support the people, communities, and nations upon whose land you live. Feel free to share where you're joining in the chat if you'd like. If you're unfamiliar with this, native-land.ca is a great resource for that. Next slide, please. Thank you. I would just say with the rest of the time, I'm just going to introduce the background and give the overview for the checklist. Allison will then talk about the 3 sections of the checklist and provide some example questions from it. Aaron will then take over and provide some use cases and examples. And then finally, we're going to close with a link to the checklist and give you all a little chance to look over it some before we turn it over to questions. Next slide. This project began with a crossover meeting between the LD4 ethics and linked data and the discovery affinity groups to support the discovery group's fantastic white paper. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. The proximal or the closest inspiration or model for this was fast.ai, 16 things you can do to make tech more ethical. The Fast AI project is just 2 people concerned with like trying to think through how the effects of machine learning on society in general. The checklist concept comes from the medical field, and it's the medical field found after many years that the best way to address inequalities in care was to provide a checklist that's applied to every single patient, regardless of symptoms, of effects, or what they're happening to be experiencing. So these are the 2 models that we're going after, and I'm happy to provide more resources for this. Next slide, please. So after a lot of back and forth and so many Google documents, just so many Google documents, we finally settled on 3 primary areas. And the 3 primary areas of the checklist are planning, which is largely focused on questions about source data aimed at projects in their developing stages, but it could also be useful if you have a long-running project that wants to reevaluate the basis. The second area is implementation, which kind of offers more practical questions about what the data project looks like in action, how it adheres to broader guidelines and standards. And this is more about individual team members that are responsible for the actual implementation. Finally, the third area is maintenance, which offers questions meant to provoke discussions around what day-to-day ongoing maintenance entails for the specific project and how it engages with its audience or users. These 3 areas are explicitly artificial. They're just meant to group things into loose categories. And there's lots of questions that could go into both categories. Next slide, please. These 3 areas are divided into 8 subsections with the exception of planning, which I'll return to at the end. But these 8 subsections is general, which consist of broad questions that aren't easily placed in any one thematic subsection. Second is accessibility, which is questions about like literally can disabled people access the website or project or data. Second is the data itself accessible. Is it meant to be open? Is it meant to be closed? Who should have access to that data? The third area is provenance, sources, and citation, which is questions connected to project source data, its origination, its provenance, its veracity, and how it credits others. Finally, second next is oppression and harm, which consists of questions about the potential harms caused by data, their projects, and or the way that data project documents oppressions itself. Fifth is inclusion and diversity, which consists of questions that consider how project or the data includes or excludes diverse communities, perspectives, and opinions. Sixth is identity management and privacy, which is connected to project manage individual identities, its use of personal data, and how it may or may not violate privacy and subjects' rights. Seventh is data sovereignty and intellectual property, which consists of questions around literally copyright obligations, but also ownership of data beyond just narrow legal categorization and narrow legal obligations. The eighth section is like additional resources, citations. And the planning area actually has a ninth section called sunsetting, which guides users through thinking about the death of their project or the ethical ends. We decided after a lot of talking that it made sense to place this death and like ethical end and sunsetting section into the first area, because way too many projects end or disappear from the internet or stop working, URIs don't resolve anymore. Without in the end of a project, and people should be thinking about this at the very beginning, we find. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Allison to guide us through a few different questions.
Thanks, Bree. So now I will give some examples from the checklist itself. First, let's look at some questions in the planning section. Questions in the planning section focus on data sources and are primarily aimed at projects in the development stage, as Bree mentioned. Though they can also be useful for re-examining the fundamentals. Planning also includes information on sunsetting. Since so many projects end up losing funding or being abandoned, it's important to have a plan in place for the project's end from the get-go. So some basic questions to ask in the planning stages include, does our project and its documentation follow universal design principles? How could this data be used to spread misinformation, hate speech, or propaganda? Do we have an easily implementable archival plan in place for the project's data and/or findings? Has our team thought about the carbon cost for the project? Do we know the provenance of the data? Who wrote it and why? Have possible sources of bias within the data been considered? Also, are we using a group or an individual's preferred terminology? For example, Black versus African American, or Native, Aboriginal, or Indigenous? Next slide, please. Following the planning stage is implementation, i.e. when the work actually begins. Implementation questions generally focus on what the data or project looks like in action and how it adheres to broader standards and guidelines, along with information detailing each person's involvement and responsibilities. Some questions you might ask in the implementation stage include, what assumptions do we make about the lived experiences, desires, and values of the groups contained within our data? Why have we done this, and with what justification? Have we identified who is being included and/or excluded from our data and discussed the possible impact upon users? Is there a way to turn off, remove, or roll back the data in production if necessary? Are there content warnings or other mechanisms in place to warn users about data sovereignty and intellectual property? Also consider whether there are other features of or activities on our collection, platform, or institution that are working against our efforts. For example, libraries that pull data into their catalog from Wikipedia and/or Wikidata need to be aware of sporadic acts of vandalism. I've noticed this especially in comics. Marvel Cinematic becomes Spider-Man universe, or some other really random universe periodically. You should also be aware, if you're pulling information from Wikidata, that there's currently a practice with bots and/or people using quick statements to automatically assign gender to people based on name heuristics. So, for example, the name Anne is considered in Wikidata to be a female given name. So any person named Anne in Wikidata that doesn't have a gender already assigned, somebody has gone in and made everybody have a sex or gender of female. So how will that affect your data? Next slide. And lastly, we have the maintenance stage. Questions in this stage focus on day-to-day and ongoing maintenance and what exactly that entails, be it monthly audits, quarterly check-ins, or yearly reviews. Some specific questions you may want to consider include, do we have a mechanism or workflow for dealing with name, pronoun, or identity changes? If the source data changes, do we have a mechanism for updating our linked data? For example, if using Wikidata and an author has requested a cataloger change their name authority record, and the authorized form of their name changes, or perhaps a piece of data such as a birth date is removed, will it be flagged in your system, or will it still display? Is there ongoing outreach and engagement with the communities and individuals represented? Also consider what problematic terminology exists in our systems and how we will address it. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is there a mechanism in place for takedown and editing requests? Do you have a way for people to contact you if there is an issue? And after that kind of whirlwind tour, I will hand it over to Erin, and they will provide an example of how the checklist can be used in action.
Awesome. So for my section, I'm going to quickly talk about 2 related cases of using this checklist. So hopefully from this, you'll see some ways that you can make the checklist work for your specific context. The first use case is going to be a review of the CDOC CRM ontology, and the second is a review of the use of the CDOC CRM ontology, as well as Getty AAT terms by the Worlding Public Cultures Project. So before I talk about the checklist, I'd like to just give a quick introduction to the CDOC CRM so that you can get a bit of a sense of how the ontology is structured and maintained before I talk about a review of it. CDOC CRM is a stable and pretty widely used ontology for cultural heritage data. Up on the slide here is just a really high-level overview of what the structure looks, where we have things, both conceptual and physical, as well as people, places, time spans, and events, and then ways to add identifiers and classifications and additional vocabulary terms to any of that. One of the benefits of this CRM approach to structure is that it allows you to do a little bit of like plug and play with domain-specific vocabularies. So you can have this common structure, making sure that you are incorporating and acknowledging all the really deep and intensive vocabulary work that goes on in all of these different domains. So this difference between structure and vocabulary is going to come up a little bit in the review of it, which is why I like to make sure that we introduce that in the beginning. The CDOC CRM itself is maintained by a user community, the Special Interest Group, or SIG, and issues can be proposed on a listserv and are discussed through the listserv and at meetings where resolutions are then voted on. The issue that led to the use of the LD4 checklist here is called issue 530. It's about reviewing the CDOC CRM, its documentation, and its working practices with an eye to areas of inequity and bias. So there have been discussions about this that occurred over the lifetime of CDOC CRM, but they aren't centralized or consolidated. And there's only really like partial understanding of what the issues are and how they've been discussed so far. So the working group within the SIG managing this issue 530 work is co-led by myself and another CDOC CRM editor, Thanasis Velios. Some main goals of this particular issue in our working group are to establish criteria for examining classes and properties in the ontology, identifying areas of concern, and creating new issues for improving the model. So for this goal of establishing approaches to examining the data structure and its documentation, we needed a list of questions, like a list of places to begin. In order to make this, I looked to the LD4 checklist and then refined it and made it more specific for this purpose in front of us. So from that full list of LD4 checklist items, I created 12 questions within 5 categories to help guide the review process. The idea really is that these are probing questions to encourage close reading of the ontology structure and the documentation that describes it, to promote like critical thinking and thoughtful engagement. So I'm going to quickly run through an example from each of the 5 categories to show sort of which LD4 checklist items became the source for the CDOC CRM issue 530 guiding question and how they were adjusted for the needs of this particular context. So this first category here is about the relationship between the concept and CDOC CRM as a whole, so how it might align or conflict with larger project perspectives and values. The second category asks reviewers to think about the process of the creation of the concept and its definition and the sources that led to it. For CDOC CRM, this includes the museum databases and structured data sources that were analyzed in order to create the ontology in the first place. The third category looks more specifically at the label and scope note of the concept and the wording or language that's used in both defining and describing that thing. The fourth category asks reviewers to consider the concept in its use of implementation. So for the case of CDOC CRM, this is how users can put the concept into practice in representing their data. And then lastly, this fifth category sort of pushes further to ask about the potential impacts, both positive and negative, of the use of the concept. So this work has been going on for about a year now. It involves independent work amongst group members, and then we meet once every few months. We've reviewed a number of classes and properties, and out of this already started to generate a list of issues at 3 different levels. So the level of the documentation, so issues that came up with either the way it was written or the references that it builds its history on, Secondly, issues related to the class or property concepts themselves, so the label, its definition, scope note. And then also ones related to CDOC practices, because all of these things, they're built together. It's not just the thing, the end product, but also how we got there, how we built it, and how we continue to build and maintain it. So the starting point of looking critically at CDOC in terms of structure and documentation, I think has really broken open a lot of other things that are very relevant to the conversation. Namely, like who we are, who work together on it, and how it is that we work together. And then secondly, I'm going to tell you briefly about a project called Worlding Public Cultures. WPC is using existing linked data resources in order to represent their data. So they're using CDOC CRM for their structure and the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus, or AAT, as the main source for their vocabulary. But as part of this work, and really it's a key part of the work, they're asking what it means to be using these things and how one can critically engage with them when you don't have a lot of control over the resources. So how can you make something that exists in the linked data world already fit for your project and do so in a way where you're attending to some of the implications of the use of these things? So to guide their review of the concepts and terms that they're using in their project, they took those CDOC CRM issue 530 guiding questions that I just ran us through, and then further refined it to their needs. They scoped it down to 9 questions, and that also includes questions about vocabulary as well as structure. So for issue 530, because we're looking solely at structure and documentation, that's really what the question spoke to. But since Worlding Public Cultures is also interested in the Getty terms, it was important to have questions about the vocabulary there as well. So in doing this, they also made it specific to their context to make the starting resource of the LD4 checklist as useful as possible for addressing their needs. So this work is also ongoing. They do their review work collaboratively within small groups who meet approximately once a month to look at specific concepts and then discuss them and come up with critiques through this method of conversation and collaboration. Their findings are going to be made public as part of their work because it is part of the work of their project. It'll be published as part of their database and also contribute to the creation of CDOC CRM issues through issue 530, thanks to collaboration between the groups. So I want to end on the approaches that we're taking here for using the LD4 checklist in ways that might be sort of generalizable for other people to take on as well. So this checklist really is a starting point that can be used directly or adapted for your specific context and considerations. And I hope I showed that a little bit here. The 3 ways really that the LD4 checklist was made directed and useful for the needs that we had. So firstly is about being clear about the focus, adjusting the wording of the questions to show focus on the area under consideration here and now, like for the project that you're involved in. Secondly is to also adjust for granularity. So this again is sort of like about adjusting the wording of the questions to speak to the level of detail that's applicable for your context and that's relevant in your data and the data structures that you might be using or however else you're approaching your project. And then lastly is to make additions and do further research. So using those additional resource sections that are included within each of the 3 main sections from the checklist, and then in total at the end of the document as well, in order to do more research and help you find additional questions pertinent to your context. If you're finding that the LD4 checklist is a good starting point, but that you want a little bit more or need a deeper dive in certain areas. Really, with this checklist, we're hoping to be able to give you paths forward in as many ways as might be helpful or relevant for you. Resources like the LD4 ethics and linked data checklist are starting points for critical engagement because there are no easy answers, but we hope to give you some places to begin so that you can construct these paths forward that fit your needs and your context. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Bree.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Erin. That was wonderful. Thank you, Allison. We'll take 5 or 6 minutes to give you all a chance to read over the checklist. There's a link right up on the screen. I'm also going to share it in the chat. I'm also going to share everything I'm saying right now. We'll take a chance and read through, and then we'll have about 15 minutes worth of questions. It's a near final draft, but I've opened comments, so feel free to comment on it if you like. I will probably turn my camera off to stretch for a couple of minutes, but we'll be around and we'll call everybody back. I will just say that we are free now for questions. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom. If you feel free to drop something in the chat as well, we can hopefully address it there. I will try to cover both of those. One of the things that might be useful to know is that we did receive a question, and last time we presented this, about our choice to use data here versus linked open data or linked data specifically. And the reason we chose to use data was because that we believe the checklist can be applied to much broader projects. It can be applied to contexts that aren't necessarily linked data or necessarily linked open data. And also it does also come from the inspiration for this does also come from checklists that did deal specifically with like machine learning data.
Yeah, I think another thing that we talked about as sort of part of that same conversation was, data linked data project doesn't exist in a linked form until it is part of your project, maybe. So when we're asking questions about things like source data, you're probably asking questions about the data in a pre-linked form, and to ask it specifically about linked data in all of those times seemed like it would be potentially introducing confusion. So we're doing our best job as possible to try to be clear about the things that we're asking with data and all the different ways that it can live and be transformed throughout a project.
Thank you. A couple people have wrote in the chat to address some small issues. I think it's just to the host and panelists, but thank you for those people who have written to us to catch the small things such as a missing URL. And thank you for the people that said it's a great document. In this chapter, this will be published as part of the Ethics and Linked Data book, which is expected to hopefully later this fall or winter, or beginning of next year if Lit wouldn't run very far behind. And I will just make a plug for the book that it is amazing. There are lots of really excellent chapters in it, covering just like the huge range of linked data projects and ideas. Somebody asked in the chat what OCAP is. I don't know the actual OCAP, what this letter stands for.
It stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession.
Thank you.
Yeah, from the First Nations Information Governance Center, about control over data and data processes. I will throw a link into the chat. Oh, Bree already did. Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't remember the P. One of the questions in the checklist does point out, like, sometimes principles of like OCAP can conflict with ideas of like fair or fair science sharing. For example, not all Indigenous data should be shared in an open access sort of way. So many times you do have conflicting standards. So trying to navigate between those standards and different obligations is something that has to be decided on a case-by-case basis. The title of the upcoming book is Ethics in Linked Data. It's just named after the group because mostly the group sponsored it and has edited it. We send all the chapters off to the publishers on Friday. Then the publisher is running a bit behind just because of the general chaos of supply chain issues. So we're expecting it for the fall at this point, but it could very well be for the winter. Thank you for the link. The link that I just shared with you is CC BY. I might have CC0 in the draft, but it is CC BY. The checklist, yes. Elizabeth, sorry, the checklist is CC BY, Creative Commons BY for attribution. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Let's see. I'll read this from Gloria. Really great work. Thanks for a great overview. Data versus linked data. So much here that can be reused for other applications. I'm curious, one of our thoughts on link persistence. Do we talk about persistent policies in the book? I believe that maintenance section covered preservation, but we worthwhile consider explicit questions related to decisions around preservation and persistence. That's a good point, and there are a few questions there about persistence. And Allison, do you have any comments on that?
Sorry, I'm still reading the question.
Oh yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, I think we have a couple of questions in there, but it really would be in the sunsetting planning section, like planning to sunset section. But I think you're pointing out a good need to maybe include more like questions that are like specifically directed at the weight of the decisions that are included when it comes to presenting something that ideally is persistent if you don't have a plan for it to actually be so, or we know the realities of the world with the I think building in an assumption that a thing that you plan to be around forever will not in fact be around forever is always a good good plan, so that you are prepared if and when something does change. And that buy-in and wide support is such an important part of that conversation, especially in an institutional context. Yeah, maybe we should add in a couple more things for that direction of speaking. Thank you.
Yeah, we should really appreciate that. There is, I should say, the checklist will be saved on Zenodo, so she'll have DOI assigned to it. And I was going to say something else that slipped my mind. I'll come back to it. I did see one more question. Does linked data ethics include data feminism? Yes. I don't know if we make a explicit call out to it, so perhaps that's something that we should do, but it does definitely include that, and it's a fantastic book. And I mean, I agree with the theory in general, but the book called Data Feminism is also fantastic. Oh yes, yeah. The one of the first chapters in the book will deal with persistence. Specifically, it's a chapter by Dorothea Sallow and Ruth Tillman about the ethics of maintaining linked data vocabularies. It's very well written chapter, but it typically focuses on a few different vocabularies that now cease to exist, meaning that URIs no longer resolve. I'm not going to name the specific organizations, but I think we all know them. I will say we have about 5 more minutes if anybody has any more questions. Melanie had a question here, but do the additional resources in the implementation section specifically address assessing carbon costs? That's a great question. I'm not aware of any tool that kind of tries to address the carbon cost of linked data. I know Eric Radio and a co-author wrote a fantastic essay about thinking about, maybe it's a presentation even, about minimal computing linked data. It's thinking through like maybe we can use minimal computing or small computing for linked data. I would be very interested if there was a sort of platform or website for addressing that sort of, or trying to calculate it. Because some linked data project can use like really resource intensive computing. Oh, great. Christine shared a link here to the mini computing ontology. Thank you. Yes, that is Eric Radio's essay is really good. I highly recommend it.
Oh, this is another question from the chat. I don't know an answer, but maybe you do, or it might just be honestly the Slack channel. So from Alex, are there plans on a forum or community of sorts that can share out recommendations or suggestions in relation to the questions provided?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I don't think so yet. I think currently it's just the ethics and linked data Slack channel, which links should be available on the LD4 general like webpage for information. Perhaps when we do general release, that might be something we can think about. And a final call for questions, and we'll wrap it up. Thank you, Jim. Okay, thank you everybody for coming today. I really appreciate it, and I hope you find the checklist useful, and feel free to reach out anytime. I'll hand the thing back over to Joe.
Well, thanks so much. That was really excellent. Thank you all for your work on this. This is extremely valuable to this community. So we're very grateful for your work. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.